What if a single mistranslated word helped justify an atomic bomb? What if one rushed treaty in New Zealand rewrote an entire nation? What if a tiny unit mix-up sent a spacecraft straight into Mars? Tonight, we're digging into the translation fails that literally changed history. From presidents accidentally hitting on Poland to banks telling clients to do nothing. From ad slogans promising diarrhea to manuals hiding nuclear warnings. These weren't harmless language bloopers, they had real-world fallout. So how many disasters came down to one wrong word? Let's unpack the 39 biggest translation errors with massive consequences. Japan's mokusatsu response misread before the Hiroshima bombing. One ambiguous Japanese word ended up tied to an atomic blast. In 1945, Tokyo answered the Potsdam Declaration using the word mokusatsu. It can mean to ignore something or simply withhold public comment. Allied translators read it as stubborn rejection, not cautious political hedging. For leaders already exhausted by war, it sounded like outright defiance. Behind the scenes, Japanese factions were still arguing over possible surrender terms. But that subtle nuance never crossed the language barrier into Washington and London. The response hardened Allied resolve and helped justify using devastating new weapons. A single word became a permanent case study in lethal miscommunication. Treaty of Waitangi translation let Britain claim Maori sovereignty. In 1840, British officials rushed the Treaty of Waitangi through coastal meetings. They drafted an English version and a hurried Maori translation overnight. In English, chiefs appeared to cede full sovereignty to the British Crown. In Maori, many leaders thought they were granting governance while retaining authority. Keywords about power, property, and chieftainship mapped poorly between the languages. Decades later, British governments leaned on the English text to justify sweeping control. Maori activists instead pointed to the Maori text promising protection and partnership. That translation gap still drives court cases, protests, and constitutional debates today. Khrushchev's "We will bury you" line deepened Cold War fears. One fiery sentence from Moscow made Americans picture literal nuclear annihilation. In 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev spoke to Western diplomats in Moscow. Through interpreters, his remark was rendered as a threat to bury capitalism. To American ears, it sounded like promising to shovel dirt over Western graves. In Russian political jargon, the phrase implied historical replacement, not physical murder. Khrushchev meant socialism would outlast capitalism, like an heir burying an older generation. Nuance vanished once newspapers repeated the line as a direct death threat. For many Westerners, it became the defining quote of Soviet aggression. Misread rhetoric helped harden Cold War paranoia on both sides. Jimmy Carter's Poland speech interpreter said, "I desire the Poles." A goodwill visit to Warsaw turned awkward thanks to one overwhelmed interpreter. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter traveled to Poland to stress friendship and cooperation. His American-Polish interpreter struggled with complex phrasing in Carter's Southern accent. Phrases about wanting to understand Polish hopes became crude personal longing. Lines about leaving the United States temporarily sounded like abandoning it forever. Journalists reported snickering in the crowd as the mistranslations piled up. Polish listeners knew something was off, even if details were unclear. Diplomats later downplayed the fiasco, emphasizing the warm reception overall. Still, the mishap became a legendary example of live translation pressure. The Ich bin ein Berliner Jelly Donut translation legend. One of the most famous supposed translation blunders never actually happened. In 1963, John F. Kennedy addressed West Berlin near the Brandenburg Gate. He declared himself a Berliner to show solidarity with the divided city. Later, English speakers claimed he accidentally called himself a jelly donut. In reality, Berliners use a different word for that pastry entirely. German grammar also makes his phrasing perfectly acceptable in this figurative context. Crowds in Berlin cheered, not laughed, when they heard the line. The donut joke only spread decades later as a quirky language anecdote. It shows how an imaginary mistake can overshadow a powerful historic moment. Michelangelo's horned Moses statue, born from a Latin translation error. A famous Renaissance sculpture gave Moses horns instead of a glowing face. When Michelangelo carved his Moses for Rome, he followed a Latin Bible. That version rendered a Hebrew word about rays of light as horns. So the artist faithfully gave the prophet two sturdy protrusions on his head. For centuries, viewers wondered why this biblical lawgiver looked strangely demonic. Scholars eventually traced the confusion back to that earlier translation choice. Later Bible versions switched to describing a shining or radiant face. But the stone horns remained, frozen in marble above Michelangelo's careful drapery. Today, the statue is a reminder that translators guide what artists imagine. The wicked Bible's missing not ordered readers to commit adultery. One missing word nearly turned a moral commandment into a scandalous invitation. In 17th century England, royal printers produced a new edition of the Bible. On the page with the Ten Commandments, a tiny word vanished completely. Instead of forbidding adultery, the line suddenly appeared to encourage it enthusiastically. Authorities were furious, fining the printers and recalling as many copies possible. The edition quickly gained the nickname now associated with it by historians. Surviving copies became notorious collector's items, worth far more than normal Bibles. For religious leaders, the slip showed how typesetting errors could twist doctrine. All from one three-letter word accidentally left off a crowded page. Virgin or young woman, a Bible translation shaping the Nativity. The Christmas story many people know rests partly on one tricky adjective. An ancient Hebrew prophecy mentions a child born to a young woman. When translators rendered it into Greek, they used a word implying virginity. Centuries later, that Greek text heavily influenced early Christian writings about Jesus. The detail shaped how believers imagined Mary, miracles, and divine intervention. Some scholars argue the original line meant any young woman of marriageable age. Others defend the traditional reading as consistent with later theological interpretation. Either way, a single vocabulary choice changed expectations around an entire religion. It shows how theology can pivot on one flexible word. The Red Sea, or Reed Sea, Exodus geography lost in translation. A famous miracle scene may depend on which body of water you picture. In the book of Exodus, fleeing Israelites cross a suddenly parted sea. Hebrew wording suggests shallow reed marshes rather than today's deep saltwater gulf. Ancient translators rendered it as a more dramatic colored sea instead. Over time, art and preaching embraced the grander image of towering waves. Some historians argue a marsh crossing fits local geography and weather patterns. For believers, the precise location matters less than the meaning of deliverance. But the translation choice still shapes maps, movies, and Sunday school illustrations. Different seas create very different mental pictures of that midnight escape. Number of the Beast, 666, or 616 manuscript translation confusion. Apocalypse fans love arguing over a number that might not be fixed. The Book of Revelation names a mysterious figure with a coded value. Most printed Bibles give the famous 666 as that number. But some early manuscripts list a slightly different trio of digits. Scholars debate whether scribes miscopied symbols or corrected what they thought wrong. Both numbers can be tied to political figures using ancient letter number systems. For centuries, people have matched the code to whatever villain they feared. The variation shows how fragile numerology becomes when manuscripts disagree. Even a single changed digit can fuel endless prophecy speculation and panic. Hell from Sheol translation helped define centuries of Christian teaching. Ideas of fiery punishment owe a lot to how older words were translated. Ancient Hebrew texts mention a shadowy underworld more like a grave or pit. When these passages moved into Greek and Latin, terms shifted toward punishment. Various words for graveyards, city dumps, and underworld realms blended together. Translators often chose a single dramatic term that emphasized torment and fire. Preachers then built detailed images of eternal torture on those renderings. Modern scholars sometimes point back to the simpler, gloomier original concept. Yet pop culture still imagines a blazing cavern far below the earth. Translation stacked image upon image until an entire spiritual landscape solidified. Mars Climate Orbiter lost to metric imperial units translation failure. One robotic spacecraft disintegrated because two engineering teams spoke different measurement languages. In 1999, NASA's Mars Climate Orbiter approached the red planet after months traveling. Navigation software expected thruster data expressed in metric Newton seconds of force. A contractor's code instead fed the system numbers in old imperial units. The mismatch slowly nudged the spacecraft into a dangerously low Martian trajectory. By the time controllers realized something was off, it was too late. The probe dipped into the atmosphere and likely broke apart almost instantly. The loss became a classic case study in unit conversion and communication. Space history gained a very expensive reminder to double-check shared assumptions. Gimli glider fuel disaster from pounds versus kilograms conversion mix-up. A routine Air Canada flight suddenly turned into an unpowered giant glider. In 1983, ground crews calculated jet fuel using newly introduced metric units. They converted the numbers incorrectly, loading less than half the required amount. Some figures were in pounds, others in kilograms, and nobody reconciled them. Mid-flight over Canada, both engines flamed out within minutes of each other. Captain Robert Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintal glided toward a decommissioned airfield. That abandoned strip in Gimli, Manitoba was being used for motor races. Pilots threaded the silent jet between cars and spectators, landing without fatalities. The incident pushed airlines to tighten training around unit conversions and checklists. Tokyo Disneyland Space Mountain axle ordered in inches instead of millimeters. A roller coaster train derailed because one replacement part was ever so slightly wrong. The original design used metric measurements, common for Japanese manufacturing standards. Someone placed a reorder using older inch-based specifications from previous documentation. The resulting axles were almost the right size, but not quite. Tiny extra space let the parts vibrate, loosening components over repeated runs. One day, a wheel assembly broke free, derailing a car on the track. Passengers were shaken but miraculously avoided serious injuries in the incident. Investigators traced everything back to mixed measurement drawings sitting in the archives. KFC's finger lickin' good became eat your fingers off in China. Fast food branding hit a culture shock when a slogan crossed into Mandarin. A fried chicken chain brought its famous catchphrase to China during rapid expansion. Translators tried to capture the playful idea of food tasting unbelievably good. Local customers mostly understood it as clumsy foreign advertising rather than cannibalism. Still, the story spread worldwide as a textbook example of translation awkwardness. The company quietly adjusted wording to emphasize deliciousness instead of self-destruction. Today, marketers use the tale as a warning about literal phrase conversion. Word-for-word translations rarely carry the flavor of the original language. Pepsi's Come Alive slogan said it revived dead ancestors in Asia. Another soft drink campaign became famous for a translation legend that likely exaggerated reality. During a particular advertising push in East Asia, Pepsi leaned on energy and youthfulness. English speakers later claimed the local slogan promised to resurrect customers' deceased relatives. Researchers have struggled to find hard evidence of that exact phrasing. Still, versions of the story keep appearing in marketing textbooks and conference talks. The legend persists because it captures real pitfalls of literal figurative language. When one culture uses vivid metaphors, another might read them alarmingly literally. Whether or not every detail is accurate, the warning remains powerful. Ambitious global campaigns now test taglines carefully before printing billboards overseas. Coors Turn It Loose turned into Suffer from Diarrhea in Spanish. A beer company's laid-back slogan reportedly became much less refreshing in translation. In English, the phrase suggested relaxing, unwinding, and enjoying a cold drink. Early Spanish versions circulated that sounded closer to losing control of one's bowels. Even if the exact wording varied by country, the joke stuck quickly. For Spanish speakers, the unintentional bathroom reference was impossible to ignore. The story spread among translators as a warning about slang like turn loose. Marketers later retooled their language to focus on freedom and fun differently. The episode showed how casual idioms can sour when moved across languages. Sometimes letting go is not the message you want on a bottle. Parker Pen had accidentally promised not to impregnate wearers' daughters. A pen company trying to reassure customers accidentally made a very strange guarantee. In English, the ad promised reliable pens that would not leak in pockets. Spanish translators tried to express the idea of preventing embarrassing ink stains. The result implied the pen would not cause pregnancy for the wearer's daughter. Readers were understandably puzzled by stationery suddenly claiming birth control powers. The company quickly revised the campaign once the blunder was widely mocked. Behind the humor was a serious lesson about checking connotations, not just dictionary meanings. Precision matters when your sentence sits on billboards and glossy magazine pages. Got Milk campaign asked Spanish shoppers, "Are you lactating instead?" A hugely successful dairy slogan stumbled when it stepped into another language. In the United States, the question about having milk felt playful and teasing. When transplanted into Spanish, the direct question sounded far more personal. It lined up uncomfortably with asking whether someone was currently producing breast milk. For many Spanish-speaking consumers, the phrasing felt intrusive instead of charmingly casual. Campaign planners adjusted their wording to focus on strong bones and family moments. The incident became a go-to tale in marketing and translation workshops. It shows how short questions can carry very different cultural baggage. Sometimes the safest tagline is not the most literal one. HSBC's Assume Nothing slogan translated as Do Nothing Worldwide. A global bank paid millions to fix a three-word branding mishap. Its English slogan encouraged customers not to make assumptions about financial possibilities. In several markets, translators rendered the phrase closer to "sit back and act." The unintended message suggested laziness rather than curiosity or open-minded planning. For a financial institution, telling clients to do nothing was disastrous branding. The bank scrapped the phrase entirely and rolled out a new campaign. Rebranding costs ballooned as signage, brochures, and commercials had to be replaced. Executives later cited the episode as a painful translation budget cautionary tale. Short, clever taglines can be the hardest to move across languages. Electrolux's "Nothing sucks" like an Electrolux confused American shoppers. A Swedish vacuum maker deliberately leaned into a double meaning that backfired abroad. In Britain, the slogan's playful tone fit a culture used to cheeky ads. The word suggesting suction and poor quality created a memorable little contradiction. When the same phrase appeared in the United States, context shifted dramatically. American slang made sucks feel much harsher, closer to calling the product terrible. Some viewers saw it as bold humor, others saw it as clueless. Myths later claimed the line was an accidental translation disaster, not deliberate. Either way, it became legendary in advertising circles for attention-grabbing wording. Sometimes being too clever crosses the line into unintentional self-insult. Mitsubishi Pajero name meant a vulgar slur in Spanish markets. An off-road vehicle rolled into Spanish-speaking countries with a very unfortunate name. In Japanese, the model designation sounded rugged and distinctive for a four-wheel drive. Spanish speakers, however, immediately recognized it as an obscene slang word. Dealers worried that family buyers would hesitate to park that badge outside. Rather than rely on customers to overlook the insult, marketers pivoted quickly. In many countries, the vehicle was rebranded under a different, cleaner name. Car enthusiasts still use the original label, but brochures rarely do. The case is now standard material in cross-cultural naming seminars worldwide. Testing product names with native speakers became a non-negotiable checkpoint afterward. Chevy Nova urban legend about doesn't go Spanish translation. For decades, people repeated a story about a car that supposedly never sold. The tale claims Spanish speakers avoided the model because its name meant no-go. In reality, the vehicle sold reasonably well in several Latin markets. Spanish-speaking drivers easily understood it as a brand name, not literal phrase. Linguists have pointed out that similar constructions appear in other product names. Still, the legend refuses to die in marketing presentations and business books. It survives because it neatly illustrates a real risk of unlucky names. Teachers now use it to explain why urban legends outlive corrected facts. Sometimes, the most viral translation story is the one that never happened. AMC Matador car name sounded like killer to Puerto Rican buyers. Another car company learned that heroic imagery in one culture can sound grim elsewhere. In English, the model name evoked a daring bullfighter facing danger stylishly. In Puerto Rico, the word overlapped with associations of killing and violent conflict. For a mid-70s family car, that was not ideal driveway branding. Stories spread that drivers were uneasy about buying something tied to death. Sales reportedly lagged behind expectations compared to similar models with friendlier names. The manufacturer eventually retired the vehicle as tastes and lineups changed. Marketers later cited it as a reminder that macho names can misfire overseas. A cool showroom badge might read like a warning label in translation. All your base are belong to us legendary video game translation fail. One clumsy English script accidentally gave the internet one of its earliest memes. In a Japanese video game ported to Western consoles, translators rushed through dialogue. Villain speeches came out as bizarre robotic phrases with broken word order. Players encountered the now famous line during an otherwise standard space invasion storyline. Screenshots of the awkward text began circulating among early online communities. Fans remixed the phrase onto photographs, music videos, and forum signatures everywhere. The game itself faded, but its mistranslated warning refused to disappear. Today, the line survives as shorthand for gloriously bad localization efforts. A tiny budget translation job ended up shaping internet culture for years. Welsh road sign used translators out of office email auto-reply. One British road sign accidentally immortalized a very human office mistake. Officials in Wales needed a bilingual warning sign for trucks near a supermarket. They emailed their English text to a translator and awaited the Welsh version. The translator's automatic response politely explained they were unavailable at the moment. Instead of waiting, staff unknowingly pasted that entire message onto the sign layout. Soon, drivers saw English instructions above a Welsh paragraph saying the translator was away. Locals quickly noticed and shared photos, turning the blunder into national news. The sign was removed and replaced once the error was publicly mocked. It became an instant classic example of why human review still matters. Nixon's "the spirit is willing" joke became rotten meat in Russian. A language school example turned into a famous presidential mistranslation tale. The story describes an English sentence about willing spirit and weak flesh. When translated literally into Russian, it reportedly came out as eager vodka. The return translation allegedly mentioned meat being strong but spirit spoiled instead. Linguists use versions of this anecdote to show dangers of word-for-word translation. Although historians debate whether Richard Nixon actually delivered that exact mangled line. The joke persists because it captures something true about idioms crossing languages. Spiritual metaphors rarely survive intact when forced through literal dictionaries. Sometimes the punchline is less about presidents and more about grammar. Badly translated medical instructions cause dangerous overdoses of prescription drugs. In healthcare, mistranslating a single word can permanently change a patient's life. One widely discussed case involved a Spanish-speaking teenager in a Florida emergency room. His family described him using a word closer to poisoned than intoxicated. Staff reportedly understood it as drunk, steering doctors toward the wrong diagnosis. Critical time was lost before his brain injury was fully recognized and treated. He survived but was left with severe, lifelong disabilities after the misunderstanding. Other patients have received wrong doses because labels weren't translated clearly enough. Hospitals now invest more in trained interpreters instead of relying on bilingual relatives. Medical language shows how translation errors can injure even without malicious intent. Misread decimal commas in Europe led to thousand-fold medication dosage errors. A tiny dot or comma can separate life-saving dose from deadly mistake. In many European countries, commas mark decimals where Americans use points. Some drug charts written for international use failed to standardize the notation. Nurses unfamiliar with one style read a decimal as a whole number. In rare cases, that meant patients receiving hundreds of times the intended amount. Investigations uncovered prescriptions where trailing zeros and cramped spacing hid true values. Regulators responded by tightening rules on handwriting, formatting, and electronic ordering systems. Modern hospital software now flags unusually large doses before pharmacists approve them. Those reforms were literally written in blood, spilled by punctuation confusion. Confused translation of may versus must has rewritten legal obligations. For lawyers, choosing between optional and mandatory verbs can cost companies millions. In multilingual regulations, a sentence about what organizations may do sometimes shifts. Translators in another language might render it closer to what they must do. Courts then face a choice between the original line and the translated version. In some high-profile cases, judges treated guidance as binding requirements after translation. Businesses suddenly found themselves punished for ignoring what began as suggestions. Appeals turned on arguments about which language held greater legal weight. The disputes pushed legislators to draft clearer, less ambiguous phrasing from the start. In law, a single auxiliary verb can redraw entire compliance landscapes. Mistranslated trade contract terms cost companies millions in unexpected penalties. International contracts sometimes fall apart because both sides sign different documents in spirit. A clause about delivery responsibilities might shift meaning across French, English, and Chinese. One version can imply door-to-door obligations, another stops at the ship's rail. When shipments are delayed or damaged, each side points to its own language. Arbitration panels then dissect word choices, industry customs, and translator notes. Occasionally, companies discover they accepted penalty levels they never meant to approve. Insurance payouts and legal fees pile on top of missed business opportunities. Today, major deals often specify a single controlling language to avoid chaos. Even then, every translated copy is combed line by nervous lawyers. Diplomatic notes' polite refusal softened into offensive insult by interpreter. In diplomacy, a delicate no must sound respectful in every language. One foreign ministry drafted a note declining a proposal while thanking the sender. The original text wrapped its refusal in polite formulas and softened adjectives. An inexperienced interpreter replaced those with blunt negatives and harsher everyday vocabulary. The receiving government read the reply as arrogant, almost mocking their initiative. Ambassadors scrambled to reassure each other that no insult was actually intended. Behind the scenes, translators revised internal guidelines for handling subtle diplomatic phrasing. Professionals now triple-check documents that walk the line between courtesy and rejection. Ambiguous armistice translation let both sides claim victory in negotiations. Sometimes peace agreements survive precisely because each party hears something different. In one 20th century conflict, negotiators drafted an armistice text in multiple languages. Key lines about withdrawal, demilitarized zones, and recognition were intentionally left fuzzy. Each capital later told its citizens that the wording favored their interpretation. Translators walked a tightrope, preserving enough vagueness to keep signatures on the page. On the ground, soldiers and commanders clashed over how to apply the terms. Skirmishes erupted around disputed boundaries that neither translation fully clarified. International observers pushed for follow-up protocols to pin down the ambiguous phrases. The case is still studied as a compromise built on linguistic fog. Early UN documents' translation gaps created conflicting versions of human rights. Foundational global texts almost launched with slightly different promises depending on language. When the United Nations drafted its early charters and declarations, speed was essential. Teams raced to produce Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish versions. In the rush, some passages emphasized individual freedoms more strongly than others. Elsewhere, social duties or economic rights were highlighted differently between language editions. Lawyers and activists later noticed that rights lists didn't always match line for line. UN bodies eventually clarified that all official languages carry equal authority. The process spurred more careful harmonization for later treaties and resolutions. Even so, interpreters still navigate tiny wording differences during heated diplomatic debates. Misrendered intelligence cables made threat levels seem hotter than intended. In the intelligence world, a mistranslated phrase can escalate tensions overnight. Agents in the field send urgent reports using idioms and coded shorthand. When analysts back home translate them, they sometimes sharpen cautious wording into certainty. Phrases meaning might plan can morph into will launch under pressure. Leaders briefed on the stronger language see an imminent threat requiring swift response. Later reviews occasionally reveal that original sources were far more tentative. These gaps often only surface during post-crisis inquiries and classified document releases. Agencies now invest heavily in language specialists familiar with regional slang and nuance. The goal is simple: stop linguistic overstatement from steering national security decisions. Poorly translated safety manuals led to fatal industrial machine misuse. On factory floors, confusing diagrams and bad translations can be deadly. Some imported machines arrived with instructions barely understandable in the local language. Crucial warnings about lockout procedures and emergency stops read like riddles. Workers improvised, relying on guesswork and habit instead of clear written guidance. In several documented accidents, limbs were caught during maintenance that should have been impossible. Investigations traced the incidents back to misunderstood instructions and missing warning labels. Manufacturers were forced to revise manuals and provide proper training materials. Regulators responded by demanding certified translations for high-risk industrial equipment. Lives literally depend on whether technicians can read the words beside the diagrams. Confused evacuation instructions in multiple languages trapped passengers during emergencies. During emergencies, every second lost to confusion can cost human lives. On some ships and in crowded transport hubs, announcements go out in many languages. Bad translations have turned clear directions into vague, contradictory, or meaningless statements. Passengers hear one language telling them to stay seated, another urging evacuation. In smoke or darkness, people hesitate, unsure which voice to trust. After disasters, inquiries sometimes identify language confusion as a key factor in casualties. Operators respond by rewriting standard phrases and rehearsing them with multilingual staff. Pictogram-heavy signage and color-coded routes now back up spoken messages. The aim is to remove guesswork from those terrifying first 30 seconds. Mistranslated airline cockpit phrases contributed to deadly misunderstood pilot commands. High above the ground, even subtle language differences can break cockpit teamwork. In some aviation accidents, flight crews shared only partial proficiency in a common tongue. Captains used polite or indirect phrases that subordinates misread as suggestions, not orders. When translated into official reports, those lines sounded firmer than they felt on board. Communication training later emphasized standardized command phrases and clear challenge response patterns. Pilots worldwide now learn to avoid ambiguous yeses and hesitant confirmations. Accident investigators repeatedly highlight how cultural and linguistic habits shaped reactions. Modern cockpit procedures try to strip away room for misinterpretation under stress. Every radio call and spoken checklist item carries lessons from those tragedies. Faulty nuclear plant manual translation hid crucial warnings about cooling systems. In nuclear power, unclear instructions are not just inconvenient, they are terrifying. One plant received technical manuals translated from another language by non-specialist contractors. Key sections described emergency actions if cooling systems lost pressure or flow. Awkward phrasing and missing qualifiers made some steps sound optional or routine. Operators assumed they were reading standard maintenance guidance, not urgent failure procedures. During a later incident, staff hesitated to activate safeguards that seemed excessive. Investigators realized the original documents had carried much stronger, clearer warnings. Regulators forced utilities to audit every translated manual inside their facilities. When your job is preventing meltdowns, you cannot afford fuzzy verbs.